Well, hello, everybody, all those that are coming into the webinar. So glad that you're with us today. This is our, I believe our ninth series, webinar in the series. And so we are so excited for today's conversation. This webinar is titled Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This is a free webinar series. We have a total of 14 sessions that meet monthly on the topic of qualitative inquiry and the doing of inquiry, inspired by a range of post-philosophies. If you've been following us for a while now, you'll notice that our panelists draw on a range of philosophical perspectives and different theorists that inspire their work as inquirers of our world. And so I'm Candace Kuby, and I am co-hosting this webinar series with Viv Bozalek. So we are both excited to be doing this project together and have you with us today. The webinar series is made possible through a collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System and the University of the Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between our universities started many years ago in 1986. And the funding for the webinar series is provided by the committee that oversees this collaborative partnership for our universities. This university partnership supports opportunities around teaching and learning, research, community engagement, and we are so grateful that our university's longtime collaboration and for the support of this particular webinar series. The webinars are also available to you on YouTube. You can find how to access our YouTube channel, or you can just go directly to the webinar series website and you'll find a link that will take you to the YouTube channel directly. Also on YouTube, you can select an option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar. So you can find the three little dots or the three little buttons and click on that, and that will be provided for you. We also have shared a few times now that this webinar series will be turned into a publication format in the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry. So stay tuned. You'll hear more about that over time as our panelists take what they shared in the webinar and create it into the format for a journal article for qualitative inquiry. Also, always be sure to check out the website for our exact times for the webinar with different time zones and daylight savings times. We've tried to update the website so that that's as clear as possible if any changes happen from month to month. So to get started today, I'm going to ask our panelists if they will just unmute and introduce themselves and their position and the university they're at. And after that, I'll get into some more introductions and more information about how the webinar will unfold. So if you don't mind, the three of you can each just take a turn unmuting, say hello, and we'll welcome you to the webinar.
Should I start? Hello,
yes,
everybody. I'm very happy to be here and very thankful for the invitation, and great to meet all of you or see you here on the screen, but also very happy, of course, to have participants here with hopefully you find it interesting what I have to say. My name is Kathrin Thiele. I'm an associate professor in the graduate gender program at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Yeah, and I'm in a long collaboration also already with Vivienne Bozalek on different research projects and educational endeavors. So I'm very happy to be here.
Welcome. Dierdre, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Dierdre Donoghue. I am thrilled to be here today and be able to be part of this discussion, so thank you. I am Kathrin's student at Utrecht University, and I'm just coming to the end of my PhD and being a few weeks away from officially submitting.
Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to be here to have this opportunity to converse. I'm Pinar Turer. I graduated around 6 months ago from Utrecht University's Gender Studies RMA program. And I have also co-authored with Kathrin one of the readings, the Relational Matters. And I look forward to discussing more.
Thank you. Welcome to all three of you. We are excited. I also want to introduce Erin Price, who's on the screen with us today. Erin is a doctoral student at the University of Missouri, where she serves as a graduate research assistant with me. Erin is also an artist and art educator with experience coordinating preschool through secondary art education in US public schools, as well as community-based art explorations at home and abroad. Erin is particularly interested in the role of material invitations, affect, and artistic encounters, and the becomings of identities and community. Erin is also providing a lot of technical support for this webinar series and on the platform today. She'll assist us in moderating the question and answer portion of the webinar. She also is the one who helps with our editing and putting up all of these recordings on YouTube. So thank you for your time with that, Erin. And she provides the beautiful artwork for this webinar series, which is on our webpage and any of the reminders that we send out on social media and on our videoed or the recordings that you find on YouTube. So thank you, Erin, for sharing your talents as an artist with us for this webinar series as well.
Thank you. It has been wonderful just to be a part, to be along for the ride with all of these wonderful discussions. So I'd like to have the opportunity to introduce our two co-hosts. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape, and also an honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, posthumanism and feminist new materialisms, and innovative scholarly practices in higher education. Her most recent co-edited books include Posthuman and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education. Dr. Candace Kuby is an associate professor of learning, teaching, and curriculum at the University of Missouri, and also department chair and the director of qualitative inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests include the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, and approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. She is the co-author of several books, including Posthumanism and Literacy Education, Knowing, Becoming, Doing Literacies. And her scholarship appears in journals including Qualitative Inquiry, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and Cultural Studies and Critical Methodologies. I just want to thank you both for making this space possible for us.
Thanks, Erin. So just a little bit of an overview of the platform today that we're using and the webinar itself, and then we'll be jumping into conversation. So as you might notice, we're using the Zoom webinar platform instead of the meeting platform. So only our host and panelists have the audio and video functions. But we do encourage you, if you're just now coming in, to introduce yourself in the chat box. Feel free to say hello, let others know that you're here. It's a great space for people to connect throughout the webinar today. As mentioned, we are recording this webinar for public viewing later on YouTube. And we also invite you now to find the Q&A button or icon on your screen. It's located at the bottom. This is what we'll use during our question and answer portion of the webinar today. It makes it a little easier for us to moderate the questions that are coming in instead of scrolling through a chat box with lots of other comments and things happening. So we'll definitely be looking there to pull questions out, lift questions out to ask of our panelists later on today. Feel free to go ahead and start populating questions at any time. And we'll be sure to look at those when we get to the Q&A portion. So the structure of the webinar is as follows. Viv will be our lead interviewer today, and she'll spend about 30 to 40 minutes on the 4 main questions that we're asking all of our panelists in this webinar series. While discussing these questions, we invite Kathrin to share from the suggested readings if there's examples or things that she wants to draw upon there. Viv might also ask some questions as well. And then Viv will spend some time talking about how mentoring happens and how graduate students engage in post-philosophies in the doing of inquiry when being mentored by Kathrin. And then we'll ask our panelists and the former students that are joining us today, Dierdre and Pinar, to be able to dialogue with us about their relationship in doing post-philosophy inspired inquiry and the learning that they've done under the mentorship of Kathrin. And then we will also have time for questions and answers to happen a little bit later on. And again, you can use the Q&A button to start populating those as we go throughout today. So I think, Viv, that we've gone through all of kind of the overview and the Zoom platform itself. So if you want to jump in with a fuller introduction and a welcome, and then we'll get into our 4 questions.
Yeah, welcome everyone. pleased to see we've got about 35 people thus far in our as participants. And what I'm going to do now is I'll introduce Kathrin first and engage with her with questions, and later on I'll introduce Pinar and Dierdre. So I just want to say a few words about Kathrin. As Kathrin said, she is an associate professor in gender studies and critical theory at Utrecht University. And her research intervenes in contemporary feminist debates around systemic inequalities, decoloniality, and new materialism or post-humanisms, with specific attention to questions of relationality, implicatedness, and entanglement. And together with Birgit Kaiser, she's founded and coordinates the international research network called Terra Critica, Interdisciplinary Network for Critical Humanities. Kathrin's recent publications include Biopolitics, Necropolitics, Cosmopolitics, Queer Feminist Interventions, which was a special issue that she's been working on, and it's now published in the Journal of Gender Studies, and it was co-edited with Christine Quinnen. Also The Ends of Being Human, returning to the question, a special issue for Philosophia, a journal of continental feminism, in 2008, co-edited with Birgit. And her most recent book publications are Systems of the Planetary Condition, a critical vocabulary, co-edited with M. Buns and Birgit Kaiser, and Doing Gender in Media, Art and Culture, co-edited with Rosemary Bakermar and Plate by Routledge 2017. And then most of you who are coming here today will know that we have two readings which Kathrin offered. And the one is co-authored with Magda Górska and Pinar Turer, who's with us today. That was the one on relational matters, vulnerable pedagogies, care and carriance, a carefulness in higher education. That's a chapter in a book on posthuman and care ethics. And then the second we're lucky to get because it's forthcoming. Kathrin generously shared it. It's called After Humanism, the Problem of Time and as Transformation in Critical Thinking. And that's in a book by Birgit Kaiser, Kathrin Thiele, and is it Tim O'Leary? No. You muted, but you
Timothy,
can tell
it's Timothy. Timothy O'Leary.
Timothy, yeah. The Ends of Critique. So welcome. We've been waiting a long time for this, Kathrin, and I've had a few conversations about it, and now it's coming to pass eventually. So, Kathrin, our first question that we've been posing to everyone is, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry?
Thank you so much for this kind introduction also, Viv. It's really great to start this conversation with you once more. Thank you for everybody who made this webinar possible. It's really great that you're doing this in these difficult times. It's one of those, for me, rather few, but very nice occurrences in this time. So thank you once more. So the first question, what can I say about? So when I read this question a few times, I think what I hear most is that I should talk about how, or I would like to talk about a little bit, a longer answer maybe on this first question, how I relate to philosophy and how this really influences of my doings of doing inquiry or inquiry. And like a few others, I think from this webinar, a few other scholars you have spoken with already, I would also like to do this rather biographical, as I think it is really my approach also to who I became or who I am at this moment. So philosophy for me is actually the matter of thinking. So thinking and philosophizing, I'll see very much together with, I learn a lot from bell hooks and especially bell Hookson's approach to critical thinking And it really speaks to me when she writes in her book on critical thinking that thinking for her, or kind of thinking spaces, are for her a laboratory in which we might get an understanding of how life works. I find this extremely impactful for my own way of doing inquiry, but also then in maybe of my way of how I teach, or how I try to transform this also in a pedagogy. And when I listened to a few of the sessions, I was especially maybe drawn also to Erin Manning's beginning, where she speaks about that children are versatile critical thinkers. And that is very much in line also what Hooks says in her introduction to this critical thinking. And to me, this is very similar. And I wrote part of a quote from bell hooks down, because here in preparation, I would just like to read this, because for me also, to think is not something that we have to learn anew, but that actually happens always already, I would say. But it is in Hooks' work rather sadly that children's passion for thinking often ends when they encounter a world that seeks to educate them for conformity and obedience only. And maybe that is a little bit of a guiding motto for me for this first way of how I see myself as doing philosophy. Because I would also continue from here saying, I don't think I ever say I am a philosopher, though my research clearly is, and I would even say my everyday practice, or practicing the world, is probably best described as philosophical. But for me, philosophy is not something that's interesting as a discipline. For me, it's much more a potential to live the world. It is also a line of flight, and here one hears a little bit my Deleuzian upbringing in some way when I was a graduate student. It is something to work through problems, or to unwork established, naturalized or normalized habits. So it's problem-oriented approach to the question of philosophy, or the question of thinking. And it's not the volatile, I think, therefore I am, which tries to categorize or define the world. But I think some Cartesianism is also within my own thinking still, because I connect thinking and being very much, I would say. But I see it much more as a movement of becoming, rather than a description of who I am. A becoming that is also pushed for from the outside. I'm forced to think rather than I willfully sit down and start thinking. And that is actually most important to me in this question, what it means in philosophy is for me the matter of thinking. I also come maybe to philosophy, or to philosophizing, that in that way that I am a German person being born in the 1970s, where the history of the collective inhuman and inhumane indifference, that was very much a non-thinking approach. And I learned a lot from Hannah Arendt's insights into the banality of evil. It was extremely shocking for me as a younger person when I read it for the first time. But it also taught me from that early age a lot. And I learned how maybe to fathom with, or really to make some sense of what has happened during Nazism in Germany and during the Second World War could happen on such a broad collective and social level. So not to think is for me at the bottom of many forms of violence and worldly disasters. And not to think does not mean that one doesn't use concepts or understandings correctly. It happens a lot, I would say, that concepts and understandings are used, but in a non-thinking manner, I would say. That's maybe something to discuss later also. But to think in the sense I use it is, or how I relate also to philosophy, means that I'm opening up and become someone else in the process of doing this thinking. It means to learn, to see, to feel, to hear differently, or to sense otherwise, to open up to more than what I saw or heard at first. And it is, not to be confirmed in what I thought at first, but actually to be transformed or transposed in some way. And in that way, thinking for me, I think, is a practice, an act, and is one part of the practicing of the world for me. It's not a matter of intelligence that is quantifiable or measurable. It is always already something that's happening within us. And in that sense, I also would like to say it is a maneuvering of the world itself, I would even want to say. So it's not even that I would say it's human exceptionalist. It's certainly specific how we as humans engage in the matter of thinking, but it's certainly not, we are certainly not the only species on this planet, I would say, things within the world as worlding. So the theory practice divide that is so dominant in research or in higher education and in all kinds of different forms of standardized learning spaces and philosophies is to me still a mystery why it holds for so long. I do not understand how one can separate these things out so much. I cannot understand that one believes that one practices something after one thought, or that theory comes before one practices something. By that, I don't want to say that they are both the same. I would always say I think theory and thinking is practice and practicing. Not every practicing is at the same value, thinking or theorizing. There is a difference, but I would maybe say that a practice without thought at all is not a practice for me either, or is not practicing. So in that sense, this remains an entangled knotting together of theory practice or think practicing, as I call it usually when I'm writing on this, or when I try to give this a conceptual terminology. By having said that, I think I can say that I want to stress once more that for me, thinking is something that everybody can do and is also maybe necessarily always already doing. It is for me a real engagement with the world. It is a creative praxis. And maybe I can link a little bit of a personal story here at this moment, because I would always ask why I'm so much into theory and conceptual or philosophizing. And it looks like as if I'm very much into abstraction or into things that are beyond, above the happenings of empirical reality. But actually it comes from me, the way I'm engaging with philosophy, it comes from me very much linked to an experience when I was younger. I was not at all a good student for many different reasons, and not a very good student in high school. And so I can really say that for a long time in high school, I failed many, assumptions about what if I'm intelligent enough or kind of prepared enough to continue, for example, for higher education. And what saved me through this time and what kept me confident that I can do what I wanted to do, I think there are two kind of convictions that I learned in my early life. And that is that I grew up in a family with a mother who was not allowed herself to go to school when she was young, but very much someone who would have very much liked and always educated us in this, that education and learning and knowledge is what helps us or helps you opening up the world for yourself and tries to get you something else, a creative, a sensing engagement, becoming a responsible and also a pleasurable human being. And but she did it in a way that linked very much to our upbringing I come from a very musical family. So we also, it was very natural to us to at the same time be very much engaged in playing instruments, singing, doing this kind of creative praxis as if it comes naturally to us. And I want to link these two things because I had a very good friend in that time, and he was brilliant in school and he was basically the best student, and he nonetheless had such difficulties to sing. He could not sing. He simply was never using his voice in that way. And he was so unhappy with that all the time. And so we really trained and practiced singing with him. And he always trained and practiced with me, that I stayed confident in this time while I thought I failed in the terms of being an intelligent student. And so why I want to bring this together, to me, these things come together in that way that I do neither believe that there is a purely gifted or genius-like sense of being creative, if it's painting or if it's art in that sense, or if it's music. I think it is a practice that you can learn. And my friend became a very successful musician, actually. And this shows to me that it is rather a question of training or practicing, a very mundane and earthly doing. And it helped me to see that something that an art practice that is so often that either you have a voice or you don't, either you can play a musical instrument or you cannot do it really properly, that this is not, that this is not how one should approach this. And the same, just to me also, is this otherwise engagement with the world as a thinking being, that it is not about, that you have to be very trained in the most classical or most mainstream and standardized methods to achieve philosophizing, but it is actually very much a practice that has a much more zigzagging or a much more modest approach to what we call thinking. And so I want to say that this practice thing is for me really something of a daily doing, and that helped me to after school really still believe that if I want to engage in this world via knowledge production, going further into educational training, that I have the capacity, even if certain standardized models didn't work so much for me in the past. So my mom never educated us, so to speak, according to the grades we got, but always in a manner that kept the pleasure going, kept the practicing and the pleasure in gaining knowledge growing in us. And I think that is very much how I see my task also as a teacher now, or as someone who's writing on the question of critical thinking, that I try to bring across. That it's an opening up rather than a mastering of something. And that is what I link, I think, very much to art practices itself. And maybe two last thing I want to say why I find this important for my doing of inquiry, or how I do inquire into questions that I'm treating that are philosophical in nature. Maybe I think I do by now say that I find philosophy as a discipline a rather problematic discipline. You know, it has a lot of problems. The canon is very stagnating. And in that sense, I'm very happy to be interviewed or kind of in conversation about post-philosophy, because in that framework, I think matches most what I am doing. And it is indeed a way of doing philosophical inquiry as a material engagement, as a transformative, and as a transformative process, and as an indeterminate activity. And that is important for me, to give a picture of a different kind of philosophy, that we can do philosophy differently. And on a more pedagogical level, I think I hope, and that's maybe something that at least Pinar, I mean, Dierdre, I never really taught Dierdre. In the Netherlands, it's different. We work collaborative very much with our PhD students. And I do this, of course, also with my RMA students, and the RMA I'm really teaching, so to speak, but I'll try in my theory courses, which I most of the time I'm responsible for in our program, very much to create an atmosphere where this hurdle to engage with theories is lowered, where it becomes much more an intimate conversation, where it becomes pedagogically accessible, and to see that we're actively shaping and reshaping questions that we are carrying not only inside this classroom, but actually carrying with us throughout life. And that helps also sometimes to really overcome existential personal situation. And it helped me always to overcome question that I had of the meaningfulness or non-meaningfulness of the world. And thinking is, as I said before, an important material engagement. And thus it matters how we politically, aesthetically, and socially do it. We can do it in a way that reestablishes colonial orders, or that has maybe the approach to decolonize. It can, you know, re-institutionalize the established frameworks of racism and sexism, or it can really work for furthering social justice. So,
thanks, Kathrin.
Maybe I want to stop here.
I just wanted to do a couple of follow-up questions, and I hope I'm not preempting what you're going to be saying later. But, you know, in reading your pieces, I was sort of intrigued by your notion of transformation. So I'd like you to elaborate a little about that. You have sort of referred to it. And then also, I don't know if you're going to be going into this later, but the notion of critical think, you know, how does thinking relate to critical thinking? And how does that relate to critique? So I myself am very interested in, you know, critiques of critique. And I wondered how you related to Barad's critique of critique, and sort of going more with diffraction as an alternative, and also with Erin Manning, who's highly critical of the notion of critique, and Brian Masumi. So just a few things about those, if you wouldn't mind elaborating.
Yeah, maybe I start from the last thing. I do see a lot of resonances between, say, Erin Manning's, and in the past also Brian Masumi's, as very much one of this the most prominent Deleuze translators or Deleuzean scholars, and how I understand the matter of thinking. But I see also that they, also with the Sense Lab, are much more going in direction of affect and more the affective register and the sensing. And while I think we all share a kind of an understanding of thinking that is not exactly not delimited from what I would call feel thinking, terminology that Bracher-Ettinger, I feel, uses a lot. It's feel thinking rather than conceptual, crystal clear, definitory thinking. I indeed, I think, connect more to the critical line than either of these two scholars in their work. And that's very nice that you're asking this. I thought about this. We speak about methodologies later, and I thought that I precisely will come back to this question, because it is indeed a question of methodology that is important here. But just to say that much, I'm indeed really trained as a critical thinker. I really have a PhD degree in critical thinking. That is really, I think, a rare thing by now today. But why am I drawn to the question of critique still has also maybe something to do with that precisely the critical theory tradition in Germany was, of course, one of the most important theory traditions that helped to indeed relate and bring to the fore the problematics of positivist scientific understanding in Germany. So I think, first of all, I'm very much brought up in that line of thinking, but I left it indeed long time ago already, on the sense that I'm with everybody who critiques critique as an ideology critique. So I'm really not, I also with, not only with Manning or Brian Massumi, but in as much with Donna Haraway, who is very influential there to me. And then also, of course, Karen Borad, whose transformation of critique as not a judgment, not a opposition, not a subject that distinguishes itself from an object that is evaluated and rejected, but as something that has a specific form of intensity of engagement with something. So the intensity or that intimacy that I'll have with the subject matters I'm engaged with or I focus on, that I would call the potential of criticality, that I would call criticality, actually. I think that is what I still keep, that this is an analytical sharpness or an exposing, in a sense of not to expose mistakes, but to expose myself to the problematics, to the multi-layered problematics of things. That is what I would call critical. And there indeed, diffraction as a different engagement with how we interrelate, but also differentiate things out, seems to me a much, much more productive and helpful way forward. And that comes to this question of transformation, way forward, than indeed this ping-ponging of right or wrong, good and evil, which keeps oppositions in place, and you're either on that camp or on that camp. You said in the beginning of your introduction, I'm very much convinced that I'm always implicated in what I'm engaged with. And implicatedness, I mean, also again, biographically, I see myself implicated in the past that I inherited. And this implication has a certain dimension that has also that I cannot not have in relation to a political impetus or to an ethical urge. And that is also something that I clearly connect very much to critical knowledges or to criticality. So in that way, I think I'm very convinced that we need critical thinking and that we need critique as a form also in democratic processes, also in democracies. It's important, but it is not about putting myself outside something and critiquing something, looking from it from the outside, but actually precisely implicating myself. And that's the model of interactivity and diffraction, where there is no outside really that I can jump to either as a critical thinker, criticizing criticizing something, but I'm also not outside in the sense of that I'm not always already implicated also in the very doing of what I am presenting as critical knowledge is. And that can lead, I think, there I'm also trained, of course, very much in the critical thinking tradition of feminist and queer and from all different lines, queer studies, that criticality is a modus of transformation, that is why why I'm doing what I'm doing. When I'm engaged with question of politics and ethics, of course I'm addressing problems in order maybe to help to contribute to a different vision of something or to some sort of transformation towards something else. But as my After Humanism piece shows, I also find it, we have to be very careful as critical thinkers to not reintroduce via always pushing transformation the same underlying structure of progress, that we can be better than the before, that we don't underline, that this logic also gets disrupted. And that is what I think I'll try, at least in this new piece on After Humanism, where I'll try to figure out how we can think transformation not as a progress narrative, because that is certainly also very closely related to the legacy of critique.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to ask you more about that. I'm not sure, you haven't answered the second question, which is, what does this philosophical approach make thinkable or possible for inquiry? I think you have sort of started doing that, haven't you?
Yes, I have, but I could
dealt with that.
Yeah, I could.
I wanted to ask you then, in relation to that, what Atwood, you had that quote by Margaret Atwood.
Yeah.
One of her books, which I haven't read, but I'm quite excited to see it. Looks like an interesting novel. She talks about a sequential way. So can you explain how critique can be what you call a linear progress narrative and sequentiality, which is obviously what you're trying to move away from? But I mean, just if you could give some explanation before we go on to the third question.
Yes, I think it fits very much of what I thought we would maybe talk about or touch when we think about what does it make possible. And indeed, for me, my way of doing philosophy, engaging with thinking as a matter of worlding, and that means to me really critical thinking, is that I'll want to say that by conceiving thinking as an action, it is a reality with which we shape our lives and which the world worlds itself. And now when you say, sequentiality, and I mean, Margaret Atwood is actually not a new novel. That was actually a little book that I found as well, where different artists and also Margaret Atwood is a novelist, wrote short speeches for the 21st century. And she, of course, does it in a very literary way, but and that quote just stuck to me because indeed it is, I think, and I learned this also from very much from Octavia Butler and as an Afrofuturist author. It's very hard to produce an argument, to distinguish something, to make a suggestion on the level of concepts, on the level of philosophy, without repeating a sequential, which I want to say is a limiting understanding of how the world moves, a sequential understanding process. So in transformation, as I said already before, most of the time is thought about, there's a before and an after, and we leave behind what was before, and we often also critique what was before. And we now in the position to make it better. But of course, we know by now, next time it's another one who says like that, what we now have is not good enough, and we will go on. And this underlying progressive narrative or sequentiality, I believe, is very much what I learned very much from, indeed, Black studies, Black feminist thinking, and literary and utopian thinking is something that is at the basis of sequentiality, at the basis of the violence of having of modernity, and therefore the colonial order of being, or the coloniality of being, as Sylvia Wynter would say. And so sequentiality is one of those, that really a temporality is one of the deepest levels of where I think I would like to make a contribution to of how we can reshape or rewire ourselves to tell stories otherwise. And
yeah, sounds
yeah.
similar to Walter Benjamin's sort of objection to progress narratives.
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Yes, it's also, I very much like his backwards looking angel that that precisely brings to the fore this this moment of sequentiality of that we believe that the past lies behind us. And of course a gentle realist, which I'm by now I often try to mix or kind of bring into conversation an agential realist or a critical posthumanist perspective with decolonial thinking, because I do believe that both of these lines, while they are very different, have these lines of thinking, have at their very heart the insight that past, present, and future are not sequential. They're not following after each other. They're actually with us. And while the Western tradition, like say with Barat, and from Derrida, we learn this hauntedness of our here and now. I think, other non-Western ideas and thinking from the start don't start with that sequential ordering of past, present, and future. And so in that sense, what I hope to make available is that while we might feel we don't move that much then with critical thinking, not after this new proposition of how things would be better, I read specific authors for their impact on me, how I shift with them and how I turn and how I learn via that to rewire myself. And that is the learning process, I think, that I'm very much fond of, which I find that is a moment of change that I would like to, I affirm. And what I also wanted to say maybe in this second question was that I also, on the more philosophical level, I was always very interested in ontologies, and ontology is so kind of the most deepest kind of classical, metaphysical foundation level of philosophizing, but with an approach that I already did with my PhD thesis when I developed an equation that was ontology is ethics, that actually was before I even encountered someone like Barat. This kind of togetherness of the trying to understand the world as one thing that is a question of how we do this, and that it matters how we do this, and that it is linked to specific responsibilities and linked to the question of where from we speak, is something where I also try then to, for example, disturb these classical orders in philosophical disciplines, namely that you have ontology, you have epistemology, and you have ethics. And I really, from the very start, think you cannot distinguish, you cannot take them apart. You can focus on specific things, but they are always coming together. So indeed, it is this knotting that I also, this knotting of which Haraway very much speaks, this knotting, and it matters which knots, not knots, that I very much consider as what is possible with this kind of more active or more praxeological approach to thinking. Keeping the critical in it, i.e. standing up for that, and nonetheless try to make a difference. I would like to mention that, and that's something up to the readers or up to my conversation partners to see how it infects them or not.
Yeah. And I would add that you always do bring the political into it on top of those other three things.
Yes, for me, ethics is never a question of morality, I want to say. I'm also not an ethics scholar in the classical sense. For me, ethics is actually an attitude, an ethos to the world, and that is political. And that also transforms what we think about ontologies. Ontologies are not that what we are in the basis sense. It's not a question of being. Every ontology is always already historical for me. This is like the egg-hen thing. There is no world before me, and then I'll inhabit it somehow. But it is a knotting together of these different forces, and that means also ontologies are not beyond history, and thus not beyond the violence that created the world as we know it.
Shall we
There's
move
no nature
on?
culture, yeah.
Yeah. Can we move on to the methodologies and how the philosophies influence your methods and methodologies, which I think you've started to talk about anyhow, because it must involve things like diffraction and critique.
Exactly. So why I turn to really the diffraction very much, because for me a diffractive approach to criticality, and I always also read, for example, I mean, I read Donna Haraway's notion of diffraction clearly for a different critical consciousness, as she said already in 1997, when diffraction was coined by her in a more sense of optical sense, and when Barat takes it up, and in their in their scholarship, I always read also diffraction also in Barat as something that keeps the critical potential, this transformative potential within it. It's not just a physicist who wants to tell us something about physics. It's really about how we actually, what we always do, can understand in a more maybe more attuned sense of with terminology of diffraction or interaction. And so what these authors or these approaches tell me very much is that it's not so much only a question about what we think, but how we do this. And the how to and from where. Of course, this is also something that I had learned a lot from other feminist traditions, and but I think this in terms of the critical knowledges, I really think that's also the reason why or how we came up with this network called Terra Critica. It is not so much that we are a network that tries to keep critique alive, but it's really about how can we transform and reconfigure critique for the 21st century within a planetary condition where we know that we are always already implicated and entangled. And how does that affect also what we mean by critical knowledges? And there, the methodological framework of the how we do this, which practices we choose, which texts we choose to read, whom we try to read together. Do we disturb canonical knowledges? Who is invited for the discussions? Where do they take place? How do we present what we believe in? All of that is for me a methodological understanding with philosophy. And so while I'm very much a humanities trained scholar by now, though I started actually with sociologies, and in the past I might have been a bit more hesitant to talk about methodologies, but actually by now I'm very clear that my approach both to what I call philosophizing or thinking is methodologically interested, namely how we do it, and also my approach to kind of the purpose why I'm doing this critique or critical knowledges is how we do this, much more so than that I'm right. So the how to, and that is also something that I hope, and maybe Dierdre and Pinar later on can speak a little bit about that. I'll try very much to create spaces also in my collaborations with students or in the university in which we learn actually to have conversations where we become otherwise, where we try to become surprised by each other, and where we take the time. And that's also why we also in this one article that the relational matter, where we spoke all about the slowing down, or the kind of the carefulness that such a methodological approach to thinking and theorizing is in need for, because you cannot just jump, you need to take the time so that things really flourish on a different level. And that I would say is very much my methodological my understanding of methodology when it comes to the matter of thinking. And as a researcher myself, or as a living person myself, I think I'm very drawn to when I'm not fully in charge sometimes of what I know, and have to learn to find ways to approach them. So I'm very much often drawn to difficult authors, for example, for authors that have a lot of conceptual make a lot of conceptual inventions. You know this that I'm working, with Bracha,
for example.
Bracha Ettinger, or with also Karen Barat, and also Sylvia Winter, certainly authors that have a lot on vocabulary. But that gives me the kind of I really try to practice this, how to approach this so that it does something. And that is, I feel, very much my methodological interest. And it leads to a pedagogy where I hope I can still, again, what I already said, ensure in neoliberal universities also that this time that it takes and that needs to be practiced and needs to be trained, so that we know what kind of questions we really want to ask, instead of merely using concepts or notions. What are they for? How are they situated? How are they, in which context do they matter? And in what concept we might have to change the language so to also be differentiated enough. All that is for me very much a methodological practice or praxis.
I did have some questions about that, but I'm going to keep them because I'm very conscious of Dierdre and Pinar, and I would really like to involve them at this point before I ask you the final question, because I see time is ticking by. So I'd just like to briefly introduce the two of you. I'm going to introduce Dierdre first. She's a PhD candidate at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry Gender Studies at Utrecht University, with her research project on maternal subjectivity, materialities, artistic processes, aesthetics, ethics, and affect. Besides her doctoral research, she's a visual and performance artist, a mother, and a birth. You pronounce it doula. In her artistic work, she most often sets up social scenarios and specifically framed human encounters where multiple relations can be set into motion, through which the production of new knowledge systems via cross-disciplinary approach becomes mobilized. It sounds fascinating, Dierdre. So welcome. And now I'm going to introduce Pinar Turer. She has a research master's degree. Now we know what an RMA is, a research master's degree in gender studies from Utrecht University, and a BA in comparative literature from, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Koch University.
It's Koch University.
Koch, sorry about that. Her master's thesis was titled Moving Through Intimacy, a reimagination of self in relation. So far, thinking with literature and dance, she's focused on the question of the self with relations of love and sexuality to explore the queer potentiality of intimate relational practices. So I'd like to invite the three of you into conversation about the last question, you know, that is really about your relationships in pedagogy, in higher education, in postgraduate studies, your experiences there. And it would seem that you were doing quite different sorts of studies with art and dance, and how that was for you. So please feel free to come in with anything at this stage. We'd love to hear your voices.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Yes, thank you so much to respond to. Difficult to decide which way to turn and where to jump in. Maybe first I just kind of give a little bit of context to my practice and how I came to be in the university in the first place doing a PhD. Lots of it is thanks to Kathrin, of course, and to many other people. I apologize, I have a little bit of problem with asthma at the moment, so my voice is not so strong as usually. So similarly, me too, like Kathrin, I am a child of the 70s, although I was not born in Germany, but in Finland, to a Finnish mother who was a teacher and who ran second wave feminist awareness groups from our living room. And an Irish linguist father who was a linguist and from whom I learned at a very early age that to speak is not the same as to communicate. And this is something to do also with the ways I have come into thinking, as well as the fact that in Finland, children of course don't start at school until 7 years of age. And effectively, Finland is just one big forest. So the first 7 years of my life, I was just playing in the woods, doing sort of self-directed inquiry. Then I think what's really important also just to mention in order, the way different order of things, how different order of things comes to affect how we learn and process things. Although I do indeed work as a visual and performance artist, my first training was in the theatre, and I think this is really crucial also in the way I think about relationality and thinking and being and doing with. So theatre and I did performance studies, theatre, directing, lots and lots of improvisation, which is really where you're really taught to pay attention to all the others who play with you, including the space around you and also the audience. And this teaches both collaboration and improvisation, which is really based on listening, responding and adding, saying yes and instead of no but. I think this came up in one of the conversations before as well. So in theatre, you are always serving your partner. You always say yes and make your contribution in order for all of you to move forward. Plus, it is not only about this interrelation, interhuman to human, it is also the environment, the space, the audience, everything. So you learn to pay attention. And I think this has been crucial for me as a starting point going into visual arts, which has a completely different sort of background and where it comes from. So theatre is very much an affirmative approach to creating and generating research and to play and inquire. After that, I was sort of more formally introduced to, similarly, interestingly enough, to Kathrin. I was also not that very good at school, perhaps because I was so used to playing in the woods that had bigger call to me. But I was more formally introduced to critical thinking and cultural studies when I was studying photography and visual studies. Coincidentally, at the same time, I was also a young single mother. So my days were filled with my undergraduate studies and caring and observing this little child unfolding in front of me. And at this point, the texts and the canon that I was being introduced to, I would be sort of reading it here, and then here would be my child unfolding and living and changing together with me. And this is when I really realized that there's a kind of discrepancy between how this experience is being described and how it is being reproduced by the texts that I was given to read, and my own experience as a mother and just a human being moving through the world. So this was another formative moment in my development as a thinker, I would say, because I really began understanding how the importance of having a practice alongside your thinking. And when I say this, of course, thinking is a practice. I say this very much the way Kathrin was using this thinking and practice, that there is a difference, but they always go in hand. And maybe I really want to say something more about that later on as well. And then I did my master's in fine art, using art making as a tool to think with. And then I entered into my PhD trajectory. So I think I'm very lucky, and I want to acknowledge Kathrin also at this point, because with a background like mine, which is not sort of classical academic education, I've been very lucky to have been able to work with Kathrin, and who has recognized that there is something still there maybe to work with. So one of the many points where I was thinking with Kathrin and Pinar also converges, I think, with the notion of care as a practice. And I would also say relationality as a practice. It is a practice. But then to bring this back to my experience as a PhD student, care takes time. Practices take time. So, and I guess this is a question to Kathrin as well as for all the others of you who have been in the academy more than my 5 seconds. So how can we practice care and inquiry, or careful inquiry, if we don't have the resource of time, if we don't have time to really live and breathe with our questions as situated and embodied beings? And I mean this in a really, really super mundane way, like sleeping with our questions. Napping was mentioned a few episodes ago. Gardening with our questions, having a walk with our questions, really giving our questions time to marinate in the world together with ourselves. And so how could we make more time for carefulness within the academy, and what kind of interventions can you imagine or have you employed, and yeah, but how do you do it? And I also want to somehow come back to this, again, the environment, and I think Kathrin also spoke about this. The key is really for me not so what is interesting, but more than what is how you ask the question and how you go about answering the question. But then this, for me, again, the space of the university, how can I put this? So also also care for the space itself where the inquiry takes place. If we think of relationality, relations always exist in a space, and the spaces and the environment also affect the kinds of relations that we then make. So it's like this feedback loop all the time. And in my different practices as an artist, mother, performer, doula, scholar, the spatial conditions in which the spatial conditions in which I do what I do is always really important for me, because different kind of environments and different kind of spaces offer different stimulus. And as such, they're also part of the embodied process of inquiry. So they offer different interruptions, different stimulus, they affect you sensorially, even biochemically. So not just what I or a person doing inquiry does, how they do it, but also the conditions that you make for your own spatially for your own inquiry, if that makes sense. For me, as someone coming outside from the academy to do my doctoral research, there have been really important big things, actually. Almost like an alien observing, okay, this is the space, and this is the space in which I am expected to do inquiry. It looks nothing like my forest in Finland. We talk about relationality, we talk about space, we talk about time, we talk about care, but show me, where is it here? And I think I would be really excited also to hear all these experiences from people who teach, like we've heard from Kathrin, of these little interventions, and to imagine together how we can sort of hack the system. So yeah, maybe I leave it at that, and Pinar has time to also throw in some thoughts.
Wow, thank you so much. Wonderful.
Wow, so many beautiful thoughts since the beginning of this session that I feel, so much input also as someone who's kind of in between things. I'm not necessarily working on something that connects me to either an institution or I try to create those like pockets of space, let's say, to kind of practice these things. But yeah, it's really wonderful to hear all these things. My head was racing to kind of, oh, that's a good point, and that connects to that. Something I noticed, which is, I think it's interesting that both Kathrin, Dierdre, and me apparently all had mothers who were teachers. So that was like, interesting. I always had a kind of complicated relationship with philosophy, and even though critical thinking, now that I look back, has always been very much implicated in how I see the world. But the more I listen to Kathrin, or the more we spend time in different occasions, I notice how right the decision I think it was kind of reach out in the first place for an internship or for a thesis, and how our approach to thinking is how crucial it is to kind of start from that same point of that burning desire to understand life, and which is like super broad. But I think I've been always kind of shy about the largeness of this curiosity, to kind of admit to everybody. But I think with Kathrin, I was encouraged to do that without kind of conflating everything to one big question, or without resorting to universalizing claims, but kind of go into the nitty-gritty of this big curiosity, or like big discomfort, let's say, towards the systems of violence that we observe or participate or stay in. So can I say there's so many things that I try to like keep in mind. Care, for example, I think I can say something about also our practice of working together. And it also, for those who maybe read or skimmed through the piece, we talk a bit about a different kind of authorial relation, or like a kind of horizontal or non-hierarchical at least relation. And that for me, kind of writing about something that I was experiencing, and because this was before Kathrin became my supervisor, but it was kind of clear that we were going to have that relationship, which is, even though we do practice a sort of quite open and caring and vulnerable, like a honest kind of trustful relationship, still it's a supervisor relationship too. But when we were writing the article, that was a relation of peers. And for me, as like somebody who's just like, kind of fresh out of the first year of the RMA, it brought up so many questions, which I'm so happy and grateful that we actually addressed in our writing process. We kind of went through those questions and through those maybe discomfort, or not even discomfort, but it's a complicated or complex, messy process. We might say in the theoretical sense that, stay with the trouble. But as also Kathrin said, none of these things are abstractions, neither for me nor for Kathrin. So this really came to life, I think, in practice, which, it wasn't necessarily a pleasant or nice experience all the time, not because of our relationship, but to kind of stay with that, okay, what is my role? How do I contribute without, or how do I contribute in a place where I'm kind of on an equal basis, which in terms of, I don't want to use the seniority, like junior stuff necessarily to kind of put that binary, but there is a difference. And that was also one of the questions. How do we work with this difference in power, in experience, in positionality? And it's messy. And I think there was something freeing in kind of seeing that and letting it sit. And this is something also Kathrin allowed a lot. I think we both shared a certain vulnerability or openness that, for example, a little like practical experience memory I have is when Kathrin shared with me through the writing process how she experiences writing, or certain negative or like certain anxieties attached to it, or certain insecurities that is in the process. And for me, someone who until that point only had Kathrin as a teacher, was something that, oh, it's not just me, so it's part of the process. So then I can kind of let go of this, also the neoliberal pressure to keep up almost a facade of like kind of being over prepared, super smart, or having always the right questions, or having always something intelligent to say. That was kind of crushing me, I think, already through the BA, even though I had always like really interesting and inspiring teachers. Is still something that systemically kind of gets to you to perform in this way all the time. So seeing that also with Magda, of course, that another way is possible. And it doesn't mean that when Kathrin told me, for example, that she also has sometimes anxiety about writing certain things, I didn't see her as like, lower in my eyes, or, having as someone who, didn't know what she was doing. No, that was not the point. But the point was that she practiced, I think, in that way, a certain trust in me and in the process that very quickly translates. And I think we also talk about this a little bit. It's a trust kind of despite and with the institution, and there's more complex discussion of it maybe in the text, but it is also a trust that I think maybe kind of thinking with Dierdre here, that is part of the caring process, that, because without that trust, I cannot imagine creating something together, because creating something together, for example, writing together, is quite messy. And this kind of brings me to Kathrin's supervision process, which I think might be interesting to kind of connect that working together and still working together, but in a different kind of modality, I guess, which I have to acknowledge that trust in that supervision process was kind of translated into a trust in me, and in the, kind of going with the intuition in the most broader sense. But when I was writing the thesis, the whole process is, this actually connects to, sorry if I jump too much, but connects to linearity and, how to practice non-linearly, or how to think practice non-linearity, which very much came up in the process, because I thought I was going to do something that I kind of, I know what I want to do. It was about intimacy, and I thought I was going to go through love studies, and I was going to think about love. And in the process, quite painful, yet, painful, but in the good way. I don't know how to explain it. That it became something else. I think when I look back at it, I see that it became almost an implicit intervention in the love studies, and it became something more about intimate relationality and knowledge practices, and how do we actually think about non-linearity in a mode, which is a thesis, that is quite linear, and that is quite, there's an end product that is expected to be a certain way. And I wanted to have high grades, of course. I wanted to finish on time, but all these things, of course, come as a certain pressure of the neoliberal university that we talk about. And as someone with a non-EU visa and on a scholarship, I especially struggled with this kind of pressure, because it felt like, okay, if I don't finish on time, they're going to kick me out of this. Not having that luxury really, of course, impedes on that playful, curious process of thinking, feeling, or thinking as practice. But I think good supervision in that sense, a trustful, careful supervision, it really matters to both kind of, deal with that stress, deal with the institution, because I knew that Kathrin was acknowledging the problems of the institution, and we were trying to like work within it, from the belly of the beast, as we put it in the piece, but still kind of, addressing the complexities in a way that indeed, how do we think of this nonlinearity, or how do we think of ambiguity, which, in a system that doesn't really like ambiguity, very much goes after clarity. So how do we kind of do that in a way that is careful, but still not completely out of the institution? So for these things, I'm quite grateful to have that experience.
Thanks so much. I'm just conscious of time now, because we need a little bit of time for questions. We have about 15 minutes, but I wanted to thank you all for sharing such personal things which relate so much to the theoretical issues that you're talking about and the philosophical issues. They really were very provocative, I feel, for academia as a whole. And they are going to leave us with lots to talk about and to think about. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And please feel free, all of you, to answer questions as well, not just Kathrin.
Great, thanks so much. Yes, there's a lot swimming for me, thinking about what you're saying and connecting to your suggested reading. So I'm excited to get into some questions here. Just want to invite all those who are with us today, if you have a question, please find the Q&A button, go ahead and start typing those in. We have one that we're going to start with, but Erin and myself will keep looking at that and moderating that and asking our panelists questions. So the first one, I think, really connects to what I'm hearing in this conversation about the university and the institution. So I think it connects nicely to what we were just talking about. And so this question might be a little provocative, as the writer writes, but the question is, why is the university, or is the university still the space for this criticality, thinking practice, care, and forms of relating otherwise? In other words, is the university still a place for us to do what we do and think how we think? So I invite any of the three of you that want to start us with thinking around this question.
Well, maybe I should take it up, as also Pinar and Dierdre. Thank you so much for your contribution. It's really humbling to hear you both speak about our time and relations together. And you both addressed this issue also, that also this question now addresses. And this relates also to what I would have said, what I would say about this last question that we were on the list about, how to see the university figure into all of this. And I have to say, to answer this question now, more that came from the audience. I came to the Netherlands, and very much, of course, I was just also after my PhD when I took up the position in the gender studies program in Utrecht, and I came in certainly with a different idea of what the university is and what it provides for than what I feel it can do now, or how I relate to it right now. And it has both to do with, I think, a learning process in terms of, professionalization, and also in terms of, knowing how the system works. But also that in the last, of course, 10 years, since I'm kind of more or less stably employed, the university's changed a lot, at least in our ways. And I think what Dierdre and Pinar spoke about, I very much totally relate to this. And I think this is very accurate. And so also the question, I would say I was more convinced that in the past that this Dutch attitude, this Dutch very good attitude, I think, that I learned also precisely from the founders of the Gender Studies program here at Utrecht, be it Rose Braidotti or Rosemary Baukema or Gloria Wecker, that you march through the institution while at the same time trying to push further in a way, or kind of push beyond. That this strategy is at the moment sometimes for me difficult to uphold as the only way, providing what Dierdre and Pinar, I think, also stressed, that Dierdre said it more in the way of, time, and that the practices and care needs time, and that if we want to be creative, we have to allow for this. And Pinar, very much, you spoke very much about, the stress also of who can stay and how can you actually maneuver in a space that is very clearly structured according to certain ideas of how one should study. And thus, I think, you know, I personally, and I feel I do this both in my teaching, but I do it's definitely, this is definitely one reason why we created Terra Critica, and with it also other practices outside of academia, and how we live Terra Critica, how we do this. We actually decided quite conscientiously to not become too much involved, to not involve Terra Critica too much into the system of Utrecht University, but to really keep it somewhere also under the radar of all kinds of different research grant application, etc., because of the output orientation, because of the framing of these things that you cannot avoid them. And while it is also not maybe such a fundable project per se, because it has a lot of, at least in the Dutch context, there's a lot of this otherwise than academic interest. It taught me in the last years that I would say the university, I still would continually want to work at the university, because it is a space where education is happening. And as I said, my mom was someone who could not go to school, higher school, and I cannot get, you know, beyond this, that I believe in education as a shaping of who we are. And universities are one of those spaces, and especially higher education was something that I enjoyed immensely during my own graduate studies and graduate studies. So I believe in this, that there is space. But I think a lot of strategies I use are also a little bit allowing for staying under the radar and being a little bit in the undercommons way, active within the university. And that is also indeed, I think I can very much relate to how we collaborate, Pinar or Dierdre, that, you know, while we are, of course, ensuring that our students can, or our PhDs can play the institution, or kind of can also play in the institution, we nonetheless try, hopefully still sufficiently allow for niche spaces where other things are also possible. And I think that is where I feel like this criticality that I think as a very much a creative process, an experimental process, a relational engagement, an intimate engagement still is quite possible. And it is meaningful because I believe in education as something that I don't want to let happen only by others and not the ones who invest in these kind of knowledges, you know. I also feel like I want to claim that space also still. That would, I think, it would be my answer to that question. I don't know if others want to join in and say something about that. But it is a very much a difficult thing, of course, to the time question, the carefulness that we also really wrote about. We were really clear that that is something that we have to kind of unlearn ourselves to constantly say yes to the institution. We have to say no to certain things. And I think the longer I'm arriving within the institution, I also learn to just say no to certain things. And then you create a certain space in which otherwise of relatings are possible. And one has to carry the consequences. Indeed, they're not always comfortable, but I would say it is still workable.
Thanks for that. We have another question, so I think Erin's going to ask the next one, which connects to this. It continues kind of on a thread here. So Erin, do you want to continue us on this thread?
Sure. So there was a question, is there a sense that a skilled and caring supervisor can perform as some kind of buffer or diffracting space against the violence of the neoliberal university? And maybe if you have notions on that, the how might also be very helpful.
Anybody of you, Pinar or Dierdre?
I mean, I can briefly, sorry, before you go into kind of maybe give tips on this. Yeah, it's kind of like I would say both yes and no, at least in the context of me and Kathrin, that I did feel, you know, cared for and kind of in a good sense of in a bubble of you know, not having to deal with all the harshness of the, you know, the kind of the methods that we were allowed to use. For example, I don't think if I was in a different program or if I was with a different supervisor, I don't think I would be able to write in the way that I did. So in that sense, I do feel that I've been protected. But in other senses, for example, the, you know, lack of funding or being discouraged from doing certain research, that I don't think any one supervisor can have that power to unfortunately protect me or others, but maybe Kathrin has something else.
Well, I would also like to say something further to the first question about the university. No, not everything is perfect within it, but there's also a lot of good, right? And I don't think, why not? It is what we've got. So I think it would be, let's use it, but I think it is key, and then Kathrin said it also, that to have a practice outside so that it becomes applied, so that you do something with it out in the real world. This would be kind of my response. That would make sense to me. And then the question about can a good supervisor be a buffer? Yes, I believe so, but call it a supervisor. I don't think, why should the supervisor become the buffer and sacrifice themselves? I think we need to look at it a little bit differently. Maybe the supervisor can take you kind of by the hand and say, right, this is how this place works. This, and kind of explain the space, so then you can kind of figure it out and say, right, okay, now I go and make a strategy. But yeah, somehow when I heard the question, I just had this image of the supervisor sacrificing herself for being a buffer. So I guess that, yeah, I leave it at that.
Thanks. I like this very much, what you both are saying again, because I've thought also what you said already, Pinar, before when we wrote our piece, it was a lot about vulnerability. And our colleague, Magda Górska, writes much more, her work is much more centrally concerned with vulnerabilities. And actually my work was not so much about this. And Pinar and Magda had a lot of conversations on vulnerability and intimacy before that also. And this is also how we kind of became the three of us. But I realized in that process also of working together with you, I realized that I think one how to, if I'm getting the question how to, is indeed to carefully tread the path of vulnerability, which should not be, and I like that I want to link up with Dierdre, that I do not want to see as a sacrificial move. I do also not believe that relationalities or that interactive relationalities should become understood as sacrificial. It should be rather indeed enhancing curiosity and enhancing pleasure, rather than being together in a vulnerable situation and feeling that one have to be protected in that sense. While I of course try, and I'm glad that of course happy to hear that some of the that we can still as supervisors also give the feeling to our to the people we are working with in the university that we can help them maneuver a more and more stricter frame of neoliberal universities. I still would also say that is actually oneself daring to become vulnerable in a process, and that is all about exactly that time and that practicing of what it means to interact, or what it means to be entangled, or what it means to really explore a certain research question that led you away from what you originally thought. To take that time and to help, to not see that as a failure, but to really see that as integral to the process. And I think I very much remember, Dierdre, when you arrived and you had such a different kind of a way of writing. And we had so many discussions in the first 1.5 years about how, you had to relearn your way of writing. And when we now see your wonderful manuscript of this thesis, one really feels like, wow, this really somehow, these conversations and these, you as yourself reshaping this and getting feedback from us kind of did that. That is what I feel like is really the how-to. And of course, it's not a process that has a recipe, but it is something that I feel has to do with allowing for the time it takes and also becoming oneself vulnerable in this without becoming sacrificial.
It's now 6 o'clock our time, and I think it's your time as well in the Netherlands, but it's probably 10 o'clock where Candace is, which means that we've come to the end of this webinar. It's been fantastic. And I really like as I said, the way in which you've gone into all of your very personal experiences. It's made it so meaningful. So thank you so much. And I'm just going to hand over to Candace to tell us about the next webinar. Thank you so much, the three of you, for your contributions. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much.
We had one more question pop up, so I guess I'll just pose to those who are in attendance today. If you still have questions that are lingering, I would think it would be okay with our three panelists that if you reach out by email, they might be happy to respond to any other questions that we didn't have enough time for today. But thanks again to you, all three of you, for joining us today. And thanks to all of our attendees that are here with us and those who are going to watch this later on YouTube. As we've stated before, it's recorded. So as soon as Erin can get it edited and up in the next week or two, we will have it there on the YouTube channel. And if you subscribe, you'll be able to get updates when the new recording gets posted. So as a reminder, our next webinar is the 11th, I believe, and it's with Elizabeth or Liz DeFreitas and Natalie Sinclair. It's on May 20th. So check the website for the webinar series to see the exact time and use an online time zone converter if you need to make sure that you're able to join us. Also, there are suggested readings from Natalie and Liz, so you can contact Erin Price. Her information is on our website if you need access to some of those readings. And then I think that it's just another echoing of what Viv said. Thank you, all three of you, for provoking our thought, for sharing so vulnerably, and for really showing us the messiness, the entanglements of teaching and learning in higher ed and in the institutions that we find ourselves within. So any last words that the three of you want to share before we sign off?
I just really would like to thank you, because I, of course, was a bit nervous how this all goes with a webinar and everything. And it was wonderful to see you all and to tell you a little bit. It was really pleasurable. I want to thank you all, and thank you, Dierdre and Pinar, of course, for coming with me today. It was wonderful. And thanks, Viv, for all the conversations we anyway have. And it was lovely meeting you, Erin and Candace, and everybody else out there.
Yes, I want to say thank you also to Kathrin for inviting me to be part of this. It was it's nice to have the boost of hope and you know, desire to engage with research, keep engaging with it, even though it's not always so welcoming.
Likewise, thank you, Kathrin and Candace and Vivienne and Erin. And I really want to say that this format is quite wonderful, and I'm very glad that it exists and that you are doing it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It was an idea Viv and I had. We had taught a class sort of together when I was able to go to Cape Town and do a little bit of it virtually, but we wanted to open it up to the world, so to speak, and to provide a space. And we are just grateful that the people we invited said yes, because it would not have happened if our panelists did not agree to engage in these. And then that was before we knew we'd have a pandemic to live within. And so I think it's also provided a space when we're not able to attend things personally and go to conferences in the ways we have in the past, to feel like there still is a space online for us to be able to engage. So yes, we are so thrilled that people have said yes. So have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world. And we look forward to seeing you in May for our next conversation with Liz and Natalie. So thanks so much.
Take care.